Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents How to Write Like Tolstoy, A Journey into the Minds of Our Greatest Writers, by Richard Cohen. Narrated by Richard Cohen.
The book is dedicated to Tim Dickinson. Preface. 2 epigraphs. The first is from Paris Review. Peter Carey, I was finally a writer. Interviewer, what was it that was clicking? Carey, age, experience, a simpler form, practice, reading, influence, getting beyond influence. Second epigraph, attributed to Somerset Maugham. There are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. At a New Year's Eve dinner party in Los Angeles, sometime in the 1980s, the magician Ricky Jay was entertaining his fellow guests with elaborate tricks, using a simple deck of cards when one of his co-diners said, "Come on, Ricky, why don't you do something truly amazing?" After an awkward moment, for all the tricks had been amazing, Jay asked the guest to name a card. "The 3 of hearts," the man replied. Jay shuffled the pack, gripped it in his right hand, then sprung it, cascading all 52 cards, so that they flew the length of the dining table and pelted an open wine bottle. "What was your card again?" 3 of hearts." "Look in the bottle." The man did as bidden, and found, curled inside the neck, the 3 of hearts. Any good magician's effects, his tricks of illusion or distraction, are akin, in at least the sense of amazement they induce, to what great writers do. Vladimir Nabokov once referred to the flawless magic of Tolstoy's style. Take the scene in Anna Karenina, where Konstantin Levin, a 32-year-old landowner, proposes to Princess Ekaterina Kitty Alexandrovna Sketspatskaya. Levin is a passionate yet shy aristocrat who, unlike his Moscow friends, lives in the country on his large estate. He actually proposes twice. On the first occasion, Kitty, just 18, clumsily turns him down, telling him that her marrying him is impossible. She believes she's in love with the handsome Count Alexei Vronsky, and that he will soon propose to her. Vronsky regards his flirting with Kitty as mere sport and turns his attentions to Anna. Levin is crushed by Kitty's refusal and returns to his estate, abandoning any hope of marriage and resolving to forget Kitty. With his earnestness and soul-searching, his concern for equality, and his committed life on a country estate, Levin shares many similarities with his creator. Consciously so. In Russian, Levin means of Lev, and Lev is the spelling of Tolstoy's first name. In some ways, he's a bumbling figure, a little easy to mock, but our hearts go out to him, and we long for Kitty to change her mind, but can't guess how it will come about after so much misunderstanding. Eventually, a mutual cousin manoeuvres the 2 of them so that they find themselves alone in a family drawing room. Kitty goes to a card table, sits down, and taking a piece of chalk, starts to draw circles on the green cloth. For a while, neither of them speaks. Kitty's eyes, Tolstoy tells us, shine with a gentle gleam. Levin leans over, takes the chalk from her and writes WYSIIWIIITOA. The novel goes on. These letters were the initials of the words, "When you said, 'it is impossible,' was it impossible then or always?" It was highly unlikely that Kitty would be able to make out this complicated question. All the same, Levin looked at her as if his life depended on whether she could guess these words or not. She glanced back at him gravely, then, resting her forehead on her hand, tried to decipher it. Occasionally she would look up at him, asking him with her eyes, "Is what I think right?" "I know what it is," she said at last, blushing. "What is this word?" he asked, pointing to the I of the word impossible. That stands for impossible, but the word is not right." He quickly rubbed out what he had written, gave the chalk to her, and stood up. She wrote, T-I-C-N-A-D. At once his face lit up. He'd understood the reply. Then I could not answer differently. He looked at Kitty timidly. Only then? Yes, but now? Read this. I'll tell you what I wish very much. She quickly traced the initials TYMFAFWTP. This meant that you might forgive and forget what took place. He seized the chalk with trembling fingers, and crushing it, wrote down the initials of the words, I have nothing to forgive and forget. I have never ceased to love you. Kitty looked at him, and her smile died away. I understand, she said, in a low voice. I first read this scene when I was 20, have reread it many times since, and still wonder at its effect on me. How could a combination of words on a page, translated words, so take over my inner world? How had Tolstoy created an encounter that enraptured me, making me feel for these two make-believe characters so strongly, and indeed miss supper in College Hall as a result? Later, I discovered that the chalk game was a retelling of Tolstoy's real-life proposal to Sonia Bears, just as the scene in which Levin insists on showing his future wife the diaries recounting his youthful debaucheries also came straight from the author's own experiences. How had Tolstoy taken such intimate events and spun them into fiction? This is what the current book attempts to pin down, with a deck that spans a lifetime of reading. "Who cares for you?" cries Alice, about to step out of her wonderland. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." Only we do come to care. That is where the magic comes in. Of course, a novelist isn't just performing a trick. He's creating a whole world that takes in themes, character, argument, cultural contexts, and much else besides. But don't forget that sense of magic and wonder, the secret in the bottle. I was an only child, brought up in a seaside resort of Brighton on England's south coast, and spent much of my early years with books. I devoured comics too, some half-dozen a week, identified totally with William Brown, while also taking in such British creations as Jennings, Desperate Dan, and Billy Bunter along the way, before graduating to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, still the only book I've read 10 times, Kidnapped, and all of Stevenson, Jules Verne, John Buchan, the 39 Steps, and the man who held up a hand which lacked 3 fingers, Edith Nesbit, most of Dumas and Rider Haggard, then, I confess, every single Agatha Christie story, and so on and on. Becoming involved in the lives of fictional characters hasn't only been my main pastime, it's shaped my moral world. Besides my own writing, I've been editing other people's prose since 1969, working on most kinds of fiction and non-fiction. A short list would include Kingsley Amis, Anthony Burgess, Sebastian Faulks, Jean Auel, Fay Weldon, John le Carré, A. Alvarez, Victoria Glendinning, Richard Holmes, V.S. Pritchett, Hilary Sperling, Madeleine Albright, Simon Winchester, Vanessa Redgrave, Diane Fossey, Studs Terkel, John Keegan, and Jonathan Spence. I've also spent several years as a visiting professor in creative writing. This book describes how any 3 of hearts ends up inside the bottle, how the authors I've read and worked with came to compose their books, and how they made their creative choices, for good and occasionally for bad. How to Write Like Tolstoy began as an outflow of my university teaching. However, as the book took shape, my aims evolved too. Although a secondary purpose is to give practical writing advice, I became swept up in how great novelists had dealt with particular problems, how Charles Dickens and George Eliot, for instance, tackled the business of rounding off a novel, how William Faulkner experimented with different narrators and points of view, or how Elmore Leonard polished his use of dialogue. I've written about what I hope will catch the attention of anyone who lights up when they read imaginative literature of real quality. The American writer and teacher Richard G. Stern said that he would never hesitate to bring into his classes the work of masters. This, he explained, wasn't meant to cheapen the marvellous, but to evoke it. The hope is to make students fall in love with sublimity and to show them it's not out of reach. I've tried to do something similar, as far as possible, using the words of the authors themselves to help explain their craft, aiming to take readers on a journey into the concerns, techniques, tricks, flaws, and occasionally obsessions of our most luminous writers. Can one, in fact, teach people to write? Brendan Behan, who famously described himself as a drinker with a writing problem, was invited by a prestigious American university to deliver an afternoon lecture about his craft. Behan's reputation as boozer and rabble-rouser meant that the lecture hall was filled to capacity, with students standing at the back and perched in the aisles, but the appointed hour came and went, with still no sign of the great man. Time laboured on. The stage remained empty. After 45 minutes or so, a more than usually dishevelled Behan stumbled in, and the audience waited, in equal parts expectant, curious, and alarmed.
Good evening. Afternoon, he crooned. Now, hands up, all of you who want to be writers.
Nearly everyone raised an arm. Behan viewed this forest with disgust.
Well then, said he, go on back home and frickin' write.
With that, he reeled off the stage. The question of whether one can teach writing hardly ends there. Kurt Vonnegut, who for many years was on the faculty of the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop, held that one couldn't make writers, and likened himself to a golf pro who could at best take a few shots off someone's game. Anne Beattie, a staff member at the University of Virginia, asked if writing could be taught, replied, "Does anyone ever say, 'Here's X, I taught X how to be a creative writer'? Teachers," she suggested, "can't put the writing gifts into you, but if they find them there, they can try to keep you from going in obviously wrong directions." One can extend this approach. The novelist and long-time teacher John Gardner believed that writing ability is mainly a product of good teaching, supported by deep-down love of writing, and pointed out that Hemingway, although on record and echoing Behan as declaring that the only way for a writer to learn his craft was to go away and write, took hours of tutorials from Gertrude Stein. He wrote to her, "Isn't writing a hard job, though? It used to be easy before I met you. I certainly was bad. Gosh, I'm awfully bad now, but it's a different kind of bad." Then take George Orwell, who began his career as an embarrassingly clumsy writer. When at the age of 24 he moved into cheap lodgings in London, he is befriended by the distinguished poet Ruth Pitter. She was the first person to be shown his apprentice efforts, finding them awkward, and Orwell like a cow with a musket. The two would go for long walks along the embankment, discussing his stories, or meet for dinner over a bottle of cheap red wine, when she would be unsparing in her criticism. But however much she teased him, she also helped explain where he was going wrong. In sum, Pitter mayn't have injected Orwell with his gift for storytelling, but she taught him to compose those stories. How to Write Like Tolstoy begins with how all books begin: the opening sentence, the opening paragraph, the whole question of starting off right. Thereafter, the chapters are roughly organized according to the creative process. How characters are created seems paramount. Most often, a character will stay with us long after the particular story has faded away. But how does one give them life? What names does one bestow? How much of a backstory should be included? Mark Twain agonized for months about one of his characters who played with matches while in a southern prison, burning the prison down and himself to death, even though that character was eventually cut and doesn't appear in either Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. Twain laughed at his self-inflicted sense of guilt, but he couldn't prevent it. So I also look at what is meant by a character taking over a story, the notion, shared by writers from Jane Austen to Jane Smiley, that fictional characters can have an independent life, an existence above and beyond their author's endeavours. Then there's a subject rarely treated in books about writing: plagiarism. Every author borrows, both from the work and from the lives of others. Shakespeare is applauded for building on Plutarch and Holinshed, while Doris Kearns Goodwin is pilloried for gathering up another writer's research without acknowledgement. What are the ethics of either of them doing what they did? And when might borrowing become a creative act in itself? Lawrence Sterne rejoiced in being a plagiarist, while Malcolm Gladwell, finding himself plagiarized, went on to congratulate the perpetrator for having added value to what he first wrote. What does it mean to be original? Where do ideas come from? The authors and their liftings run the gamut from simple theft to the grey area of writing about people you know and the harm it can do. It's not a simple issue. Every writer has to decide on a point of view to tell his or her story, whether it should be first person or third, or multiple viewpoints, and if so, how many, and when to switch from one narrator to another. Then there's the question of how close to the action the author stands. And not for the first time, Tolstoy is a prime example of an author who orchestrates narrative distance as well as narrative voice. Some of the greatest novelists love to experiment, from Jane Austen and Wilkie Collins through Faulkner and Kafka to Norman Mailer and Salman Rushdie, who has admitted that in Midnight's Children he deliberately made mistakes of fact and judgment, only later to discover that there were some unintended mistakes too, which served his overall purpose in making his narrator unreliable. Every great writer also has a particular voice, one different from those of his characters. Voice implies speech, and some authors, Ivy Compton Burnett famously, employ almost all dialogue, others very little. What does dialogue in a novel seek to accomplish? How much does one put in? How much leave out? What of direct speech, indirect speech, or internal dialogue? This leads on to the subject of irony. The word has come to imply so many different things over the decades as fashions and meanings change, yet that evolution is fascinating in itself, for it is at the heart of all good writing, challenging the reader to respond to what cannot be said, but which must be understood. A question that has perplexed me for years is what is meant by story and how it differs from plot. Is the issue no more than semantics, or is it at the heart of the way novelists set about their business? When I first read Stephen King's On Writing, still the best book on the art of authorship, I found it extraordinary how he disagreed so vehemently with E.M. Forster, who had lectured on the subject over 60 years before, and who had felt just as passionately. Both of them were wrong to take such extreme positions, and setting the two off against each other helps explain why, and indeed what makes a good story in the first place. Years ago, when my 3 children were much younger, their mother and I would take it in turns to read aloud to them. One evening I returned early from work because it was my turn to read, and we were on the very final pages of Tom's Midnight Garden, Philippa Pearce's classic story, a magical one even, first published in 1958. As I mounted the stairs to the children's bedroom, I could hear my wife's voice. She too had longed to read those final pages to them, and to make her plan work, had sent them to bed early. I sat on the stairs and listened, and as I did, thrilled to the music of the words. So I've devoted a chapter to the subject of rhythm in prose writing, from Gustave Flaubert wandering the woods near his house, proclaiming his latest lines, to Charles Dickens and Thomas Mann, puffed up from their reading tours, devoting more and more attention in their later novels to how what they wrote actually sounded. Another subject generally skirted by literary critics is sex. How does one write about it, or should one even try? The way novelists have handled the topic varies hugely, from Samuel Richardson's supposed reticence to John Updike's calculated openness, either steering clear of explicit description or trying to find a way around the censors of the day. In most good novels, sexual activity isn't an end in itself, but tells us about the characters and their story. Physical intimacy, though, can be an embarrassing subject to write about effectively, and my conclusion is that one should try. The subject of revising, whether done by oneself or responding to the advice of others, is crucial. Abridge, "Begin on the second page," Chekhov advised his brother, who longed to be a writer too. Yet, while revision most often involves cutting, pruning, cleaning up, at its best it is a revision. One needs to look with fresh eyes, not just do carpentry, although it sometimes is just carpentry. Balzac revised heavily, as did Norman Mailer. P.G. Wodehouse hated second drafts, while Jack Kerouac, William Golding and John Cheever, over the years, had to deal with editors good interfering and bad. The final chapter is about, well, final chapters, how to bring a story of any length to a conclusion. Dickens and Eliot both had trouble with their endings, while Hemingway often found the whole business impossible. Tolstoy could hardly let go of his characters, particularly in War and Peace. I say a lot about Lev, one of my favourite authors, but plenty of others play important roles, not only the great 19th century exponents, but also figures like Beckett and Philip Roth and Updike, Jonathan Franzen, Elizabeth Strout. In her guide, Reading Like a Writer, Francine Prose recalls how she has heard fellow writers say that they can't read while working on a book of their own for fear that Tolstoy or Shakespeare might influence them. Great writers can inhibit new writers, true, or maybe one reads Scott Fitzgerald or Henry James and can't escape imitating them, but more often such writers are inspiring. They've certainly inspired me. The journey through their struggles and achievements is the main thing, and although I don't expect listeners to end up modern Tolstoys, who knows? Chapter 1. Grab, Invite, Beguile. Beginnings. 2 epigraphs. The first is from Teresa Rebeck's play Seminar. Leonard. So what were we talking about? Kate. The first sentence? Leonard. Oh, yeah. Christ. Second epigraph is from P.G. Wodehouse, the opening lines of The Luck of the Bodkins, 1925. Into the face of the young man who sat on the terrace of the Hotel Magnifique at Cannes there had crept a look of furtive shame, the shifty hangdog look which announces that an Englishman is about to speak French. How to begin? I'm thinking of that moment when a writer stares at a sheet of blank paper, or today a screen, like a weightlifter assessing a massive dumbbell. The effort of setting down any mark seems beyond him. A cup of coffee is appealing, a second cup, a quick session of emailing, a short walk, even a phone call. After all such procrastinations, a final inspiration. Focus on something completely different to what was planned, and likely far better. What was it Douglas Adams said? I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they fly by. Gertrude Stein liked to look at cows in the intervals of her writing, and would be driven into the countryside to do so. Woody Allen takes constant showers to aid inspiration. Those grandes dames of post-war British fiction, Iris Murdoch and Muriel Spark, never set pen to paper until they had thought of a satisfactory opening. A novel is a long job, Murdoch explained, and if you get it wrong at the start, you're going to be very unhappy later on. John Irving, on the other hand, I'm deliberately packing in examples, begins each of his novels by writing the book's final sentence. Before he starts to write, George Steiner, the polymath and novelist, takes a page of top prose in the relevant language and reads it aloud, often until he knows it by heart. But, he says, it will have nothing to do with the subject. In The Plague, Albert Camus has his character Joseph Grand rewrite the first sentence of his novel eternally, with only minimal variations. Beginnings are notoriously difficult. E.L. Doctorow tells of being asked by his daughter to give her an absence note for her schoolteacher. He started to write, then thought, no, that's not it, and started again. The second version didn't hit the required note either. Further drafts followed until his daughter was in a state of panic, and there was a pile of crumpled pages on the floor. Finally his wife came in and, with a look of disbelief, dashed off the required short letter. Doctorow concluded, I've been trying to write the perfect absence note. It was a very illuminating experience. Writing is immensely difficult, the short forms especially. He's hardly alone. The American wit of the interwar period, Robert Benchley, was at his typewriter at the New Yorker, agonizing over how to begin. He got up, talked with some friends, and an hour later returned to his desk. He gathered his thoughts once more and typed out the single word, "thee." Then he left for a party that was in full flow down the hall, but conscience forced him back. He sat down, focused again, and typed 3 more words. Hell with it. With that, he returned to the revellers. In A. A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, Christopher Robin's unnamed narrator starts his tale with the words, "Once upon a time, a very long time ago, now, about last Friday." What that time is exactly isn't generally the issue. All that matters is that we are about to escape into a world of make-believe. The phrase "once upon a time" can be traced to as early as 1380. Not until 1600 did it become a stock opening for oral narratives. It occurs in other languages too, from the familiar to the more obscure. In Estonian, it's "behind 7 lands and seas there lived." In classical Arabic, it translates as "there was, oh, what there was in the oldest of days and ages and times." In Alach, a tongue used in Tanzania, it's "I remember something that our father told me." That reliance is a storyteller's trope, a device to indicate that one is entering a land of make-believe, assuring the reader's passage from the real world to the fictional. In the 1890s, Robert Graves's father would start any story he told to his children with, "And so the old gardener blew his nose on a red pocket handkerchief." But where and when does the narrative proper begin? The difficulty of openings has haunted many authors, as if they need to clear the air, or their throats, before they get going. Graham Greene begins the end of the affair with almost an apology. A story has no beginning or end. Arbitrarily, one chooses that moment of experience from which to look back or from which to look ahead. An additional burden is the thought of all those weightlifters who have gone before you. Early in his novel The English Patient, Michael Ondaatje argues, "Many books open with an author's assurance of order. One slipped into their waters with a silent paddle, but, unlike works of non-fiction, novels commenced with hesitation or chaos. Readers were never fully in balance. A door, a lock, a weir opened, and they rushed through, one hand holding a gunwale, the other a hat." Yet novels can begin slowly, from Oscar Wilde's A Picture of Dorian Gray in 1890 to Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. We get openings all about the weather. Equally, non-fiction books can start with a bang or a memorable phrase. Take the opening page of Isadora Duncan's autobiography, which contains the sentences, "My first memory is of a fire. I remember being thrown into the arms of a policeman from an upper window." But a work of non-fiction is often specific. One knows more or less what one is getting, whereas a novel competes with all the other fictions that have ever been written. Only one book could ever open, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Around the 1st century A.D., the pagan sometimes known as Pseudo-Longinus wrote in the On the Sublime of the slightly different opening in Genesis that this was a superb beginning, for its author both understood and gave expression to the power of the divinity as it deserved. Another biblical scholar has judged In the Beginning as the most wholly satisfactory opening any story can have. But the question isn't just how to begin a story, but how do you get someone's attention? In Laughing Gas, P.G. Woodhouse's farcical take on Hollywood, the entire opening scene is given up to what an opening scene should be. Reggie Havershot, a Bertie Wooster-like character, is typing his first attempt at fiction when he comes across a friend who he all too slowly realizes is suffering from the father of all hangovers, to whom he insists reading the start of his projected novel. After the friend has listened to a painfully awful rendering, he comments, "The first rule in telling a story is to make it thoroughly clear at the outset who's who, when, where, and why. You'd better start again at the beginning." There's good sense in this, but does it force us to continue reading?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?